On the night of March 24, 1944, a group of dedicated airmen from the British Commonwealth executed a plan that would go down in history as one of the greatest of its kind. Utilizing the work of more than 600 prisoners of war at Camp Stalag Luft 3, soldiers dug 3 tunnels in an attempt to free a planned 200 interned. The plot's culmination came at a pivotal point in World War II, tying up precious resources for Nazi Germany, and aiding, in some small way, the Allies' eventual victory in the European theater. The event came to be known as the Great Escape and was detailed in a book recounted firsthand by a POW who was witness to the whole thing. And as no good story goes unadapted, the tale was fictionalized and produced as a film epic some years later, becoming a classic of late Silver Age Hollywood. No surprises here. The timeline makes sense. Events in 1944 led to a 1950 book, which was then adapted in 1963. What is surprising, however, is that nearly 40 years to the day after the theatrical release of the film, a video game based on the movie hit store shelves. Movie tie-in games are, of course, extremely common. Otherwise, I'd have nothing to talk about. But they're usually released alongside their corresponding films, and if not, no more than a few years later, perhaps in response to a boost in the intellectual property's popularity. But what does a game adapted from a Hollywood classic look like exactly? Who makes a game like that, and why? In this episode of From Camera to Console, I'll attempt to answer those questions as we take a look at a licensed game that perhaps no one asked for. This is The Great Escape.
Everyone here in this room is living on borrowed time. By rights, we should all be dead. The only reason that God allowed us this extra ration of life is so that we can make life hell for the Hun. In North Compound, we are concentrating our efforts on completing and escaping through one master tunnel. No private enterprise tunnels allowed. 3 bloody deep, bloody long tunnels will be dug. 1 will succeed.
These are the words of Royal Air Force Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, speaking to a room full of British and Commonwealth countrymen in the spring of 1943. Over the course of 1 year, he oversaw the clandestine work of more than 600 prisoners of war interned at Stalag Luft 3 in present-day Żagań, Poland. The 3 tunnels were named Tom, Dick, and Harry, so that open discussion could be had about them without raising suspicions. Bushell even threatened to court-martial anyone who so much as uttered the word tunnel.
One didn't talk about tunnels ever. When it was heard, anybody talking about tunnel, he was jumped on. And everybody was given due notice that you never mention the word tunnel, sand, or anything like that at all. So the Germans couldn't hear anything, they couldn't know anything.
Using tools scavenged from the camp or fashioned from items such as tin cans, the tunnels were shored up with wood collected from the bunks of the prisoners.
By the time that tunnel was finished, people were strapped, tying wire and rags in there and rope to sleep on because all their bedboards were down in the tunnels.
Tom was discovered by the Germans and subsequently dynamited, and Dick was abandoned as the area of its exit was cleared for camp expansion. So Harry became the prisoner's last hope for freedom. Unfortunately, the Germans discovered the tunnel while the escape was in progress, and only 76 of the planned 200 managed to leave Stalag Luft 3 that night. Witness to these amazing events was Australian journalist Paul Brickhill, who claimed in his 1950 book that 5 million Germans searched for the missing 76 for weeks, many of them hunting full-time. Of those 76, only 3 made it home safely. 73 were recaptured, and 50 of those were murdered by the Gestapo in a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention. Brickhill's book is dedicated to the 50. The Great Escape brought international attention to the brave actions of the prisoners at Stalag Luft 3 and provided the basis for a live TV adaptation of the story that aired on January 27, 1951 as part of the Philco Television Playhouse anthology series. But it wasn't until 1963 when the Mirisch Company and United Artists began working on a feature film adaptation of Brickhill's book that the story came to life on the silver screen. Screenwriting duties were handed to a trio of scribes including James Clavell, an Australian writer, World War II veteran, and former prisoner of war, albeit in a Japanese camp. Clavell had just published a book called King Rat the year prior, the first of the series that would come to be known as the Asian Saga, ultimately his most notable work. Clavell was no novice in the realm of motion pictures either, having written the script for the classic horror film The Fly, and even writing and directing a movie of his own, 1959's Five Gates to Hell. The screenplay would fictionalize much of Brickhill's book, creating composite characters from a number of real-world participants in the escape plot. Although Americans were present at Stalag Luft 3 and may have participated in the construction of the tunnels, none of them were prominent figures in Bushell's scheme. The script changed this fact, adding in a few U.S. Air Force members to boost commercial appeal in the United States. Tapped as the arguable lead of the ensemble cast was Steve McQueen, who had made appearances in such hit films as The Blob in 1958 and The Magnificent Seven in 1960, but had yet to star in movies such as Bullet and The Getaway, which helped earn him the nickname The King of Cool. Filling out the cast was the ruggedly handsome James Garner, actor and eventual director Richard Attenborough, Charles Bronson, and Donald Pleasance, among others. Shooting took place on studio sets and on location in rural Bavaria near Munich, Germany. Academy Award-nominated filmmaker John Sturges led the production as director and producer, coming off of a number of critical and box office successes such as Gunfight at the OK Corral and The Magnificent Seven, on which he had previously worked with McQueen. In the film, the German armed forces have decided to move captured soldiers with the most escape attempts into a newly built, highly sophisticated prisoner of war camp. As to be expected, the interned try to escape almost immediately. It isn't until the arrival of Roger Bartlett, a fictionalized version of Roger Bushell played by Richard Attenborough, that a vast and complex plot is hatched to dig 3 tunnels out of camp with the hopes of freeing 250 airmen. Key figures are assigned certain tasks to see the project through to completion. American Flight Lieutenant Robert Hendley, played by James Garner, is the scrounger, responsible for acquiring anything and everything that might be needed to build the tunnels or even bribe the guards. James Coburn's Louis Sedgwick uses these items to construct tools for the digging, among other things. Danny Valinsky, played by Charles Bronson, uses those tools as the Tunnel King, in charge of the actual construction of the pathways. Steve McQueen plays Air Force Captain Virgil Hiltz, something of a lone wolf who is asked by Bartlett, nicknamed Big X, just like Bushell in real life, to escape once more to scout the surrounding area with the intention of being recaptured to bring the intelligence back. Hiltz is hesitant at first, but ultimately obliges, joining the efforts of the airmen between stints in solitary confinement, a predilection that earns him the nickname the Cooler King, perhaps the on-screen moniker that actually gave birth to his industry sobriquet. Just like in the true story, the Germans discover the tunnel named Tom, causing the POWs to switch their efforts to Harry, which becomes their ultimate path to freedom. And on the night of execution, the Germans uncover the plot in progress, stopping the operation and sealing off Harry. We follow several key characters as they scatter across the German countryside, seeking safe haven in countries like England, Switzerland, and Spain. But just as in Brickhill's real-world account, most of the men are recaptured, and 50 of them shot dead by Nazi forces. The film, like the book, is dedicated to those 50. The film hit U.S. theaters on the 4th of July 1963, taking advantage of the holiday celebrating American independence with a film largely about British airmen. The movie does feature a scene in which the Americans make moonshine to celebrate Independence Day with their fellow prisoners, British, Australian, and American alike. Grossing $11.7 million at the box office on a budget of $4 million, The Great Escape earned the number 10 spot in the highest-earning films of the year. It also garnered nominations for Best Editing at the 36th Annual Academy Awards and Best Picture at the Golden Globes. Despite what was surely a harrowing and dark time for those involved, the film is quite lighthearted, aided in that tone by Elmer Bernstein's jaunty marching theme and accompanying score. The cast is fantastic, and performances are good if lacking in the melancholy that a more honest depiction of these events would call for. But old Hollywood sentimentality is the predominant mood, and the actors perform accordingly. Sturges' direction has a bit of a refreshing edge to it, including a number of dangerous-looking stunts that feel more akin to something from the nascent New Hollywood movement that would take hold in the late 60s and into the 70s with grittier, more political films like Easy Rider and Taxi Driver. Still, the movie is fun and undoubtedly notable for being among the last of what one might call classic Hollywood films since the decline of the studio system that began in the late 1940s. While there was a 1986 video game based on the film developed by Denton Designs and published by Ocean Software for various computer systems, the game I'll be talking about in this episode came much, much later after the movie's release. Developed by Pivotal Games and published in North America by Gotham Games in association with MGM Interactive, The Great Escape landed on Microsoft's Xbox console and Windows platform on July 22, 2003, 40 years and 18 days after the movie opened in US theaters. A PlayStation 2 version was also released on October 21st of that same year. Today, we'll be looking at the Xbox version. In the game, the player takes control of 4 different characters from the film across 18 levels of stealth, shooting, and vehicular gameplay. As far as I know, difficulty settings change nothing about the actual mechanics of the game, but rather set the number of saves the player can use per level. The Save Anywhere function is certainly convenient, but use these placeholders wisely. On Easy, you get 4 saves per level. On Medium, 3 saves. And on Hard, just 2. The opening cinematic reenacts an early scene from the film in which Group Captain Ramsey, played by James Donald in the movie, is speaking with Oberst von Lüge, commandant of the prison camp. They discuss the storied histories of multiple prisoners who have made many escape attempts, ultimately landing them in this high-security facility. After this is where the game first deviates from the film. The first 7 levels all take place before the events of the movie and allow you to participate in the exploits of 3 of the 4 playable characters that are only discussed in the opening scene with von Lüge. First up is McDonald, played by Gordon Jackson in the film. The first 4 missions of the game have you stepping into his shoes as he is shot down over enemy territory and is captured. This mission familiarizes the player with the simple mechanics of picking up and using items by following the on-screen button prompts. There's also a brief shooting segment where you must take down approaching enemy aircraft, a mechanic that is never again repeated in the game. The next stage sees McDonald escaping from Dalagluft 10, a prison camp in northwest Germany. Here, the player becomes familiar with the functions of stealth that will dominate their play experience throughout the game. With the help of a map, the player follows a list of objectives, often involving speaking to key characters from the film or collecting items needed for an inevitable escape attempt. Characters are safe inside the prison barracks, but venturing out to explore the camp is where sneakiness is a necessity. Looking through keyholes in doors allows the player to see roaming guards called ferrets and searchlights coming from watchtowers. Being spotted by either of these will have your character summarily captured or even killed if the player decides to get aggressive or attempt to run away. Sneaking, crouching, and prone movements, as well as a peek behind function, serve the player well as they make their way into the open camp. Without a weapon, the player has only a couple of options to deal with ferrets and other more heavily armed soldiers called goons. A punch attack is available for taking on an enemy directly, but this will only temporarily disable the foe, and most certainly cause the alarm to sound, bringing all soldiers in the level to the vicinity and likely ending with the character captured or killed. Sneaking up behind a Nazi allows the player to take them out with a chokehold, which will permanently remove them from the stage without respawning. The final option for the unarmed is to simply avoid guards altogether. After a failed escape attempt, McDonald finds himself in a much more highly fortified facility called the Castle. In this level, the player learns about the diversion mechanic, which will be utilized a few times throughout the game. With the help of an NPC, the player can make use of a distraction that will give them otherwise inaccessible opportunities to sneak into areas or take down guards. At the castle, the player will also find a disguise, allowing them to dress up as an enemy soldier and move about freely. After escaping the stone fortress in dramatic fashion, Mission 4 sees McDonald pick up weapons for the first time to take on the Germans directly. Acquiring such period-accurate weapons as the Luger 9mm pistol, the MP40 machine gun, and the Kar 95 rifle, the player can shoot from the hip or enter a first-person aiming mode to engage the enemy. Shooting from the hip offers the least accurate shooting with an auto-aiming reticle, while first-person mode is ideal for more precise marksmanship. Entering crouching and prone modes will also apply graduating degrees of increased accuracy. The following mission introduces us to the next playable character, Sedgwick, played by James Coburn in the movie. Here it appears that Sedgwick has been shot down and must find his crashed aircraft to burn a codebook before the Germans reach it. This level introduces vehicular gameplay similar to many modern action games such as Halo. The left stick controls acceleration and reverse, while the right stick controls turning. Sedgwick succeeds in his mission here, but is ultimately captured by the Germans. The next 2 missions allow the player to take control of Hilt, Steve McQueen's character, for the first time. The only new mechanic here, it seems, is lockpicking, which is ultimately identical to other functions the player will encounter throughout the game, using a variety of tools to do everything from repair vehicles to sabotaging enemy machines. These actions require the player to hold down the interaction button as a countdown bar drains, so you'll want to make sure the coast is clear before attempting this. Although Hilt escapes from Stalag Luft 5 and makes his way out of the area, we all know where he ends up. The next cutscene introduces us to our final playable character, James Garner's Hendley, but we won't actually get to play as him for a few more levels. It appears that although MacDonald seemed to escape from the mountainous area where the castle was located, he has once again been captured and sent to the main location from the film and where we'll be spending the next handful of levels, Stalag Luft 3 Prison Camp. Here the game begins to expand on events from the film by building entire missions around relatively simple plot points. In the case of Mission 8, MacDonald must complete a long list of objectives, including disguising himself as a goon, cutting telephone wires, and gaining access to the officer's compound in order to get a train timetable, something that was done entirely off-screen in the movie. The player also gets to reenact Hiltz's second escape attempt from Stalag Luft 3, wherein he scouts the surrounding area and is recaptured intentionally.
I didn't think they'd catch him so soon. He wasn't caught.
And finally, at about the game's halfway point, you get to take part in the titular Great Escape, doing everything from crawling through the tunnel to signaling the escapees when the coast is clear and gathering the 30 feet of rope needed to reach the tree line. All aspects lifted right out of the film.
Send down 30 feet of rope. Send down 30 feet of rope.
Send down 30 feet of rope.
The next stage will have the player take control of Hendley for the first time. Just like in the movie, he has escaped with Blythe, played by Donald Pleasance in the film, who has developed progressive myopia and must be guided with a few commands, including follow, stay, and crouch. This is the final mechanic to be introduced in the game. As before, some minor events from the film have entire missions built around them. The train ride, for example, includes a shootout segment on top of the locomotive that was not in the movie, and MacDonald has a mission where he must sneak through a train station to meet back up with Bartlett, with whom he is traveling. Hendley and Blythe's second and final mission involves a number of prerequisites that must be met in order to steal an enemy aircraft and fly to freedom, making it a much more complicated set piece than it was in the movie. The end of this mission also gives the player their first hint at how different this adaptation will be from its source material. In the film, MacDonald and Blythe crashed the stolen aircraft en route to the Swiss Alps, where Blythe is then shot and MacDonald captured. In the game, it appears they fly to freedom without issue. The following mission also sees a pivotal moment from the film change to have a much happier outcome. When MacDonald gives himself and Bartlett away by speaking English, the player must run through the town, avoiding enemy gunfire until they escape, whereas in the film, MacDonald and Bartlett are both apprehended and end up among the 50 recaptured prisoners who are murdered by the Gestapo. Sedgwick's finale is more or less the same as in the movie. He makes it to southern France and finds passage to Spain by way of the French underground resistance. However, the game has him assist the group with a number of tasks, including freeing imprisoned resistance members, clearing out a French town of German forces, and blowing up a bridge to keep Nazi reinforcements from coming. The final two missions see Hilt steal a motorcycle in very similar fashion to the movie and head for the Swiss border. The vehicle mechanics are the same here, although the motorbike is much faster and more unwieldy. The player also has a kicking function that can be used to knock enemy forces off of their own bikes. Instead of clearing only one of the two layers of border fencing before being captured, as he does in the film, the end of the game sees Hilt perform the famous motorcycle jump over both fences and ride off to freedom. The final cinematic reinforces the fact that all playable characters were safely liberated in this version of the story, including MacDonald stowing away aboard a freighter, something that was actually done by Charles Bronson's Danny and John Layton's Willie in the film. As a fan of the movie upon which it's based, The Great Escape's most enjoyable aspect for me was undoubtedly the recreation of key locations from the film, particularly those inside Stalag Luft 3. Entering familiar interiors such as the shower and the meeting room gave me very similar feelings to when I played GoldenEye for the first time, having been fond of its source material. In this way, The Great Escape feels like a passion project for those involved. The attention to detail in the environments, as well as the dedication to having the player participate in a variety of events depicted on screen, has me convinced that this was made by fans for fans. Looking at Pivotal Games' body of work, The Great Escape clearly stands out, as it's the only game they ever made that was not part of their Conflict series. I don't know this for sure, but it seems like this supports my point that this was something these developers really wanted to make, regardless of its potential profitability. And I can respect that. Unfortunately, that's just about where my praise stops. The game itself is mediocre. The mechanics are a bit clunky, and I would occasionally get frustrated at the finicky choking mechanic, as it is a contextual command mapped to the same button as punch. So sometimes my chokes would register as attacks, alerting the guard I was trying to dispatch and causing me to get captured. But as the game is mostly about slow and methodical movement, it masked some of the clumsiness of the controls. I would even say I had a bit of fun with the simplistic stealth functions, but make no mistake, it's been done better elsewhere. The vehicle mechanics, while uncomplicated in concept, are equally as clunky, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the final 2 stages on the motorcycle. The bike is so fast and turning so sensitive that you never really feel like you're in control of the machine. What should have felt like an epic finale with Hilt's escape and iconic jump over the border fence turned into an exercise in frustration, loading my save over and over again, beating my head against the wall until I finally, pathetically got through the stage and across the Austrian-Swiss border. I would have also liked to see a bit more focus on the specializations of each character. While the film goes to great lengths to explain that everyone has a particular job that only they can do, and in fact a nickname that goes along with it, the game only lightly touches on this idea through mechanics. Hiltz, for example, is the only character who picks locks. Had each level been a series of tasks that only certain characters could perform, allowing the player to switch between specialists to tick off objectives while keeping tabs on where each character is, and of course what level of danger they're in, could have provided some much needed complexity, and even a puzzle solving element that not only makes the game more compelling, but more in the spirit of its source material. As is, the character-focused missions all feel pretty much the same, and that's a bit of a shame. The voice work here is definitely a mixed bag. Some of the dialogue is clearly lifted directly from the film's audio track, such as all of Hiltz's spoken portions. Everything else has been newly recorded, and the disparity in not only audio quality, but performance is jarring.
We have maps of Germany, general maps, that is. In fact, we have all the information we need for the escape routes out of Germany. But what we do not have
Is a clear idea of what's 500 yards beyond those trees.
right.
The illusion really fails when you hear the same soundbite of Steve McQueen saying "yeah" for the 2nd or 3rd time, answering an NPC in the affirmative.
Hiltz, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ready when you are.
Yeah.
Hiltz, did you get the map?
Yeah.
It also appears as though McQueen's likeness was the only one secured for the project, as none of the other avatars resemble their real-life counterparts in any way. The final note I'd like to make here is about the difference in endings between the game and the film. While I love the movie, my biggest complaint about it has always been about its tone, especially in regard to the conclusion. While the story is surely one of bravery and resolve and the power of the human spirit under perilous circumstances, the movie plays it light and airy, in part due to Bernstein's playful score. This doesn't prove to be much of an issue for me until the ending, in which, as I said before, most of the escapees are recaptured and many of them brutally slaughtered by the SS. This tragic conclusion strongly contradicts the lightheartedness of the preceding narrative and has always struck me as a strange creative choice. So in that way, perhaps the game actually improves on the ending of the film. Granted, it would be fair for one to see it as disrespectful to the 50 real-life prisoners of war who senselessly and unlawfully lost their lives, something the game doesn't even touch on. Or maybe it's just a step too far in the direction of schmaltzy Hollywood sugarcoating. But as far as tonal consistency goes, seeing our main characters successfully escape is far more in line with the movie's emotional wavelength. All in all, The Great Escape isn't terrible, and the ways in which it pays homage to the original film make me think that perhaps a lack of resources contributed to this simplistic, occasionally frustrating game that appears to have a lot of love for its progenitor. I can't say for sure, but as the game's release came suspiciously close to the 40th anniversary of the film's premiere, I have to assume that the plan was for this to be a promotional tie-in for that event, possibly forcing a crunch period for the dev team. In any case, while the final product doesn't stand up to the standards of the stealth or action genres, an admirer of the film such as myself can get something out of the experience. The Great Escape is a one and done for me, so I'll be sending this one back to solitary confinement.
Cooler.
Right.